Hey everyone, it is Eric Olson here with our special guest, Rick Taylor, and we're mixing it up this time because actually this time I've got our expert in the house, right here in the office in the studio. Rick and I work closely together, and we'll kind of unpack what that means here a little bit later. So as we get started, if someone, of course, as always, could just let us know that sound and video is happening, is all good for you, please let us know in the chat box there that you can hear us and see us. Because we've got the two of us, we are using a different mic and kind of a different setup. So I just want to make sure all that's working. So let me know in the chat that you can see and hear us. So it's really cool that I have you here, Rick. I'm going to talk to Rick and I'm going to talk to you at the same time because Rick was really one of my first mentors when I got into landscaping. And I was thinking about it today, how we met at the San Francisco Flower and Garden Show, right?
Yeah, for Penny's installation. Yeah.
So Penny Livingston, who's done an expert hangout with us. If you haven't seen her hangouts, go back to the student portal and into the expert hangout module and check out. There's a part 1 and part 2 there with Penny. So Penny was a mentor of Rick and I both 20 years ago. And where Rick and I met was Penny and her organization. At that time, it was the Permaculture
Institute of Northern California.
Right. Pink. Permaculture Institute of Northern California. They had this huge area in the San Francisco Flower and Garden Show, and they were setting up this big temporary permaculture installation, and they invited a lot of their top mentees, their students like Rick and I, a bunch of others. And so
Trayton Heckman from Daily Axe was there. Ray Kane was there at the time.
Yeah, a lot of movers and shakers actually showed up to install this temporary. I mean, literally, it was lasted for like 5 days.
Yeah. The professionals around us were taking bets on how long before our display would fall apart. I don't know if you actually knew that.
I didn't.
And it was a fantastic experience. Best of show from our peers. I can't remember the exact awards that her design won, but we definitely won multiple awards. It was a really amazing experience, and a lot of relationships were built that day or those days.
And that, and that's a good point too about relationships, because that was one of these things where Rick and I were volunteers. And I talk a lot about in the Elm School about building your social capital, developing that social engagement plan, and how being a volunteer, working in your community, just stepping up and showing up for people in your community, how that can really, you could build a business from that kind of work. And so it's really cool. Here we were volunteers with a bunch of other movers and shakers who were young permaculture landscapers at the time. We had rock walls, flow forms.
Huge flow forms. Yeah, this beautiful wicker chicken tractor. It was just completely gorgeous. There was ducks.
Ponds, right? There's ponds, ducks. So that's where Rick and I met, and it's been almost 20 years now. I went from being a permaculture activist and working in the nonprofit sector, to then starting my landscape company. And when I started out, I was literally a laptop in the corner of my living room. That was my whole office. And I bet some of you all have an office like that, just, wherever your laptop is. And Rick would come by like once a month. And he offered to mentor me for $50 an hour for, 1 or 2 hours at a time. And I know I've told you before, and I'll tell you again, that was fundamental to my success as a landscaper. Were those sessions with you?
Yeah, I feel a little embarrassed that I charged as a mentor, but one of the things is all of my mentors have originally charged me as well. And there's something about investing in your own success, even if it's them not making that much money. The feeling and the experience of sacrifice for your own growth, I think, is fundamental, whether it be personal growth or financial growth. And I had actually forgotten that I charged you, but
it was so worth it.
And it's so worth it to be able to do that for someone. It's incredibly fulfilling. Once as a person, I learned something, it's just exponentially more valuable if I can pass that on to people. It's really easy to pass on, and I have gotten where I've gotten because so many people have chosen to help me at very important points in my career where I really needed it to get to the next level.
And that's why we are here today with you all, our Elm School community, because we want to create space for Rick to share, for you to share your experience and some best practices tips and sort of your inspiration about transforming the landscape industry into a regenerative force. So we're going to get to that in 1 second. And what I've asked Rick to do tonight is to share a little bit about his story, about how he got into permaculture and landscaping and sort of what his roots were. And then one of the things that Rick, by the way, has a 20 years running an ecological landscape design company, and he'll tell us all about that. Rick and I are also partners along with Sebastian, who's in the Elm School, in a mapping company, digital mapping company, Foresight Mapping. And we'll talk more about that later as well. So I want to just kind of give the floor over to you, Rick. Let us know a little bit about your background and your experience. And
yeah, thanks. It's really exciting to be here, and I'm happy to be introducing myself to all of you, and look forward to providing some course material for you in the relative near future as well. So I'll start about talking about how I got here and to California, and at any point, if there's something you want me to expand on, I don't want it to be just about my story. And my hopes are that whatever I say is relating to you in some sense and helping to get you to the next level, whether you're thriving and momentum is moving and you can see a clear path ahead, or whether you're currently stuck or struggling, and maybe parts of my story can help get you to the next level. So I'm pretty much an open book, so most all questions I probably would comfortably answer, so please don't hesitate. So for me, I grew up in the Midwest. I grew up just outside of Flint, Michigan, which most of you probably know is a very struggling part of the country. And somewhere around age 12, I can't really explain why, I had made the decision that farming was the only thing I could do that didn't damage the world I was living in, that didn't produce waste. At that point, for some reason, garbage was high in my awareness as a kid. And so fast forward to my early 20s, led me through to California. I discovered California by following the Grateful Dead at the time, and I fell in love with this side of the country and was determined to go to UC Santa Cruz and their agroecology program and become a farmer. And the first obstacle that turned out to be perfect was I didn't get accepted. And I moved up to Southern Oregon and began working for small farmers and doing odds and ends in the landscape industry, and stumbled upon this ad for something called permaculture. And it just listed all of these things I was interested in. And I was lucky enough to take my course at Heartwood Institute, which is deep in rural Northern California, just this beautiful site, and just fell in love not only with permaculture and all that it brought me in that really eye-opening experience, but then the site that I was on was so gorgeous, I ended up moving there. And still with this dream of agriculture, and moved to Sonoma County. And it was really quite challenging to kind of merge the financial reality of a land-based career in Sonoma County with our land prices. And it started not to feel right on other levels that were less clear to me. But then I realized I have this deep passion for the built environment. And through conversations with that farmer I was working for at the time, Ken Orchard, I realized it was time for me to jump into the landscape field where I could merge my love for organic production, plant care with the built environment. And then also I have a mechanical background just from growing up, working blue collar jobs, automotive, mechanical in the Midwest. And all those kind of merged into pointing me towards the landscape industry. And that's where I ultimately started to bring permaculture principles to what I call the built environment through what we have as a C27 is our contracting license out here.
Wow. And so because I think for a lot of us too, it is bridging ecological design, permaculture principles with landscaping, design and construction. I think for a lot of us, it's this bridge that we've been looking for about how to actually take, the ecological design approach and then professionalize it, make careers out of it, have right livelihood, be of service to the community. And I know you've been in the industry longer than I have, in the landscape industry, and worked more with kind of some of the more old school folks and some of the more traditional folks. So, I mean, one question that I always love, when you riff on sort of like, where's the landscape industry at in relation to this stuff, and how is the work that we're doing as ecological designers and professionalizing principles of permaculture, the use of permaculture design, like how is that affecting the industry?
Yeah, good question. I think it's worth stepping back to actually the days prior to that installation with Penny Livingston. And so I had been trying to merge some landscape work with a small farming operation, and really at that point still using landscape to fund what I thought I wanted to do, which was agriculture. And nothing was really quite adding up. And I was actually paralyzed by this concept of embedded energy. I'm not sure if you've all discussed embedded energy yet, but we would simplify it as carbon footprint now, but we didn't really have that language at the time when we were talking about embedded energy. But just how much energy goes into almost every product that we use. It's we talk about an axe, the wood, the metal, but then think about a like something that has a motor on it. It's just the amount of energy that has been consumed to build that is phenomenal. And so I was paralyzed by that, and I was having that discussion with Penny Livingston, and she brought up transitional ethics, that we can't isolate ourselves outside of the environment meaning the social environment and the financial environment and the political environment that we're working in, and hold ourselves to such an ideal that we can't move. We don't really benefit the world by doing that. It's important to stay in touch with those ideals, or it is for me, so that I don't just mindlessly go along and only focus on making money. And it was actually out of that conversation that the tagline for my business, Stepping Towards Sustainability, came from. It came out of that conversation with Penny. And so that I've actually forgotten the question you've actually asked me.
So transforming the landscape industry from the inside out.
Yeah. So Penny really freed me in that experience. And then the garden show was a really watershed moment in terms of connecting a lot of early relationships, but you could feel it at the time that it was happening. And
I'm messing with him a little bit.
So I stepped into the industry.
Just don't run into that anymore.
Gotcha. I stepped into the industry really wide-eyed and wanting to make a change, and being unwilling to accept the status quo. I mean, to the degree that I probably stepped on toes I didn't need to, or reinvented the wheel more than I needed to. But it was my path to get in and to be different, to bring permaculture to the landscape. And at the time in Sonoma County, permaculture wasn't really a good word. It was not linked with professionalism, quite the opposite, or accountability. And obviously that's a mistake, but that was the image that was here at the time. So I felt like I was fighting uphill, and I chose not to use the word, right? And I chose to use ecological landscape company. And
I'll just stop there for a second. So for all of you who are listening in, have you experienced that before? Like calling yourself a permaculturist or saying you do permaculture design? Have you experienced a stigma, either in the professional world or in the farming world or the landscape world? I think it's interesting to get a pulse on, because Rick's talking about 20 years ago in Sonoma County, and this area that we live in is very rich in eco-literate community and people who are really into permaculture now. But I know it's not the same in other communities. And I'm just curious if anyone wants to leave a comment in there. Do people in your community, is permaculture a triggering word? Do people even know what it means? What kind of language do you use to describe your services, and is it working? Because I think that's something that you taught me early on, Rick, was about the language that we use. And what you didn't even use the word swales. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so when you start to merge into the world that's already existing, and you're getting your foothold as a professional, there's a lot we don't know about the brass tacks, the nuts and bolts of actually building things in the early part of our career. So it's kind of hard to step in and change things when you don't really have the credibility necessarily or years of experience to back it up. But with the swale incident, the swale
incidents, there's probably a lot of them.
There's a few of them. So we found that old school equipment operators and engineers, a swale is a very specific thing, or at least generally it's pointed downhill, and at the time was often lined with concrete. So we stopped using the word swale when we were dealing with people who weren't familiar or didn't care, or maybe didn't even need to know about permaculture in order to meet our end design goals, because they had an isolated portion of the project to build. So we renamed them CIDs, contoured infiltration ditches. And we thought it was a really cool name, but also nobody knew what it was. So they couldn't take liberties and just go out and build it. They would have to ask the designer, what is this? What does this mean? And then you have the opportunity to educate. And then if a bond is built between you and that person, then you now have them as a resource, because quite frankly, they knew a whole lot more about building these things than I did. But I knew that they had to point sideways instead of downhill. And that was a major shift for these operators. So they couldn't think on their feet because I had upended the world that they had been used to working in. So.
Yeah. So how often do you run into that kind of thing where you're incorporating an ecological design approach or element, and how much are you having to educate other professionals, engineers, architects, clients?
Yeah, these days not as much, but early on it was pretty phenomenal. So I joined the local Landscape Contractors Association in California. It's the California Landscape Contractors Association. They're quite large. We have regional chapters. And I joined to kind of be a part of that community and to infiltrate it, if you will, as much as I could, and bring a different approach. And I went through the pretty standard cycle of not even being listened to, and then being laughed at a little bit, and then criticized and even ridiculed. By the time you're being ridiculed, that you've reached a higher tier and people are starting to take you seriously. And spent a lot of time within the CLCA giving talks. And there was a group that kind of held the old school line. There was a group that saw that we needed to change what we were doing. And they were willing to help boost me up and give me that platform. And so within the industry, I was trying to point out that not only were our models and our specific installation techniques ecologically viable, but that I was able to charge above market value for them, so that I could then, because that was the main argument, was you can't make money doing this. And very few of the techniques we do are inefficient. I think the sheet mulching drip irrigation interface, sheet mulching planting sequence is the biggest one that the industry still can't wrap its brain around, because it isn't the most efficient way to install drip irrigation and mulch in the plant sequence, but it's the most efficient way to build soil while suppressing weeds over the long term. So you just have to stretch out your timeline a little bit to be able to understand and see its full value.
So we have some great comments here. Jesse says, most people I talk to don't know what permaculture is, and it's difficult to explain quickly. I found that people understand the meaning behind ecological landscaping right away. And Jessica says, yes, there's been a stigma, so much so I hesitate to say the word, but also for a reason. I hesitate to hire people who have just taken a PDC. Arrogance, no follow through, bad and sad.
Yeah, I can relate to all of that. When I have to describe permaculture in a nutshell, I label it as a design methodology. and that has a certain set of ethics and principles that are then applied broad scale. And that's, I stay kind of in that realm because it is a design methodology and it is something people can choose to adopt or not adopt. And in terms of it reaching mainstream, before I hit those points around the PDC, because I can speak to that as well, I'm finding that some of the low-hanging fruit and some of the ways that we can make the most impact is through drainage and how we move from drainage to infiltration, right? And I've watched the civil engineering community really come on board. And I have to say that I think it's because of the regulations California has mandated on how we treat water. We do understand the importance of our creeks, and a lot of communities across the country do. And all those kind of runoff rules have really helped. And I've seen the civil engineering community really rise, especially in the last 5 years.
So, and I think that's really powerful. If we, and when we talk about transforming an industry like the landscape industry or the construction industry, is that we can't, if we're the vanguard of an ecological consciousness into design and construction, it's not really enough for us who are waving the flag to be the only ones. We have to get those other professionals on board. We've got to get those engineers up to speed with infiltration over drainage. And as soon as they start to get it and promote it, and it becomes part of their, the toolkit that they pick up when they go to a site, now all of a sudden we have a bigger level of change, it seems.
Yeah, we have a wonderful civil engineer that we've worked with for years. I know Eric works with him too, Jeffrey Lowe from Lescure Engineering. And the first time we met, the clients had brought us in after a dehydration model had already been installed for drainage, completely approved by the county. And that's a big step. When you want to change a grading plan, you have to be working with the civil and the engineer and the approved plan. So it forced us to have to go back to the county when the clients asked us to address it. And Jeff jumped right on board in the middle of that meeting and said, I'm right here, let's do this. And when he took our plan in at the time, the county said, we don't know how to permit this because we've never seen this before. It's running completely perpendicular to what we're used to, but you just met the regulations that are coming your way that you don't even know are coming yet. And so we're going to approve it. And so that that was a really rewarding experience to be a part of, right? To have that go through the permit process. And the permit process in Sonoma County is quite challenging. It's not a normal process in terms of comparing it to the rest of the U.S.
Or the world too, because we have a global community here. So obviously finding out about what kind of regulations are in your community, your city, your county, your state, and how it relates to things like changing the drainage patterns or creating infiltration swales. If you start getting on some of these bigger projects and you got to get this stuff permitted, those departments may not have any understanding of, even what these ecological methods that you're suggesting.
Yeah, and it's kind of a different vein, but it's important to know about all these different disciplines because where I've been lucky enough to position myself is earlier on in the process, where sometimes I'm coming in before the house is built. So I'm working with all these different disciplines, the civil engineers, septic systems, structural engineers. And so I've gotten to know what's really sitting under the ground and how much effort, excuse me, how much effort, how much money has been put into it. So it's good to educate ourselves on these systems so we at least know if we're coming in after the fact that we don't undo something or potentially get too close to a septic system with a swale and get untreated water brought to the surface, which then is a human health condition or human health hazard. So it's great to know these different disciplines.
Yeah. Let's see, another comment coming through here. Adam is saying most organic and or biodynamic farmers I've talked to over the years, they appreciate the ideas and notions of permaculture, but they don't see the practicality on a large scale. They also say they've never seen a permaculture system that, quote, works, unquote, meaning a system that seems profitable. So Rick, so let's address the kind of the thread that's coming up around the language and the approach of permaculture, we've had the thing about the arrogance. Someone comes out of a permaculture
Yeah.
course and they're like, woo woo, like, let's go swale the world, man, and herb spiral swale the world. And what is an appropriate approach to look at implementing some of these innovative or maybe non-innovative solutions? And what have you seen works in that way? And I'm going to step out for a second.
Sure.
So just go for it.
So thanks for waiting for us to get back to that point. We went on a little tangent with civil engineering. So I can really relate to someone stepping out of a PDC course and being hesitant to hire them. So having gone through a PDC course and teacher training and trying to weave permaculture into my business to the degree that I can and still be profitable within the market that I'm in, I too came up with a similar struggle where people would step out of those courses ready to change the world, which is really fantastic, right? But there's a real brass tacks component to it that when you step out of a PDC course, you're not a landscaper. You potentially, if you have landscape skills, they didn't necessarily come from the PDC, I guess is what I'm saying. And so I've always, had that struggle of wanting to hire people with the PDC, but really as a landscape firm, if my system that I operate in, my business system, my design system is permaculture based, it's not actually super critical to have employees that are immersed in that culture as well. It seems like a great ideal, but it isn't necessary. What you really need is someone who understands the skills of landscaping. And so that was a piece that I too bumped up against with the idea of hiring someone straight out of a PDC. I'm going to lean in and read this other question because I think there was a subtlety I may have missed. The stigma. Yeah, I was lucky enough to start my company at a time where ecological literacy, or the desire for ecological literacy, was beginning to rise. Plus, I'm in Northern California, which is a bit of a bubble. So I combined that permaculture side of things with a high level of professionalism in the way that I presented in my advertising. I put myself and positioned myself right next to the longstanding leaders, established companies in the industry, whether they were actual leaders or just appeared to be. Some of them were true leaders. I didn't mean air quotes in a derogatory way. And when I would show up to clients' homes, I would have a beautiful information packet that I put a lot of time and energy into. So I had a little marketing coherency and consistency. And that combination between the eco side and the professional side was absolutely critical, because that's what was missing, right? I shared the belief system around ecology, or at least parts of that, with the permaculture community that existed here. But the folks who had chose to implement it didn't share my same values regarding professionalism and financial security and things of that nature. And so I built my model based on what was important to me. And there was a certain part of it that was hard, right? Because I couldn't fully build the ideal, of what I really wanted to do is go out and build food forests and the full on, if you will, permaculture. I was supporting a family at a young age at 25. And I had a real kind of financial reality I had to face. And so I had to make some tough choices in how my ideals hit the road, right? And so I don't know if I coined the term, but I use the term subversive ecology. So if I didn't have a client base coming at me that wanted true permaculture, like most people didn't want food forests, and most of the people I work with still don't want food forests. I'm lucky enough to be building a beautiful one right now. But it has not been the norm over my 20 years. So the way that we operated the business, the way that we did soil enhancements and took a sheet mulch system and made it work with commercially available and materials that were fast to install, and the way that we moved towards organics and away from synthetics, the way that we moved away from organics and used biology, because the plants that we were using for the most part didn't need that extra fertilizer, even organics. And even organics have a very heavy carbon footprint. So if the client came in and asked for a country cottage garden, it would already have been elevated in its eco-literacy, because the way that we did soil enhancements and weed suppression through sheet mulch. The types of plants that we chose were not only the beautiful flowering colors they wanted, but they were habitat, they were medicinal. Maybe they built mulch, maybe they were nutrient accumulators. So we were able to subversively bring all that in while giving them exactly what they wanted. Right. So it wasn't that dreamy permaculture that I wanted to install, but I took pride and I found great satisfaction in that challenge of like, okay, how do I give people what they're asking for, but make it ecologically literate at the same time? And so I feel like I'm still doing that today, just in different formats at different scales. My returns are diminishing right now. Like, I'm looking for the next edge that we can really innovate on if the client's not, asking us to innovate in that area. So if you have a client who says, please build me a food forest, go to town, like that's golden. But if you have a project that's really important to you financially, to build your company or even just to pay your bills, and it's not the ideal permaculture design, then I really encourage you to keep digging in there and see how can I green this up? Because the industry is still fighting for water conservation in their plant choices. Like, we've been having the same conversation for 20 years and probably long before. And I really honor and respect all the work that people in the industry are doing to fight that fight. It's just a fight that is difficult for me to get behind. It's just not compelling. It's not that it's not important, but I just kind of want to pull my hair out. I want to talk about other things. And so, but that's what it comes down to, is we all have a finite amount of time and energy. So then there's so many important causes we can put our time to. So where is that intersection between what we have in our skill set and what we're passionate about? Because you're going to need that passion to drive you to give up evenings with your friends or your spouse or your children to go out and fight that fight. Water conservation is obviously incredibly critical, but I didn't have the passion to fight the fight. There are people that can do it better, right? So I took a different path. Wow.
We have some great questions. So did you take this one from Jessica yet?
No, I have trouble reading.
Okay, no problem. So Jessica's question is, any advice for folks in much less permeable to ideas places? I just moved to Utah, where collecting more than a small amount of rainwater is illegal and the old guard is staunch.
Yeah, just before I address that one, I feel like there's the other piece of the question that we didn't answer was about the PDC, and not the one where we addressed, not hiring someone straight out the back. And I addressed how they didn't have the full landscape skill set. They had a permaculture training. And so that's what Eric has been working on, and that I and others have joined in on, is these are my words. I'm not sure if you actually see it the same way, but I feel like ELM and its predecessor courses that we have done in Northern California are mixing a PDC with vocational training, like teaching you how to do landscaping. And I feel like that is what the permaculture community really needs, is to be able to take this kind of life-altering, mind-altering shift that happens in a PDC course, and then funnel that passion through a vocational training that gives you a practical skill set, whether it be landscaping or agriculture or something else.
Well, and I should say, some of you might not know that Rick was one of the lead instructors with the ELI program, the Ecological Landscape Immersion program, which was the predecessor to this course at the Elm School, which was the on-site version. And we had a 9-month, 6-month and 9-month versions of the ELI course, which didn't prove to be sustainable for us to run that program again this year. But Rick and I have been teaching this stuff to students for the past 4 years. And one of the things we'll be doing is beyond Elm, we're going to be releasing some more focused short course with Rick in the coming months, an online course. And then we are adding a lot of short in-person programming at the Permaculture Skills Center for the more advanced. We have like an advanced drip irrigation course with Robert Korick and stuff like that. So just on that vocational stuff, I want everyone to know, like, we haven't lost track of that hands-on vocational need that people have. It's just for folks to travel out to Sonoma County to live for months at a time doesn't prove sustainable for most people. So we're creating, so we'll be doing a lot of short focus courses. And if anyone wants to come out and get a hands-on vocation with us at some point, that would be amazing to meet you in person. So I just wanted to plant that seed.
Yeah, and I think Elm is doing a great job at meeting that vocational need without it being an in-person course.
Yeah. So. Yeah. The projects are your projects and your businesses. And then we're here to coach you along the way. So the question about the staunch old guard who can't get in these new ideas.
Yeah. It sounds similar to what I stepped into here in Northern California. And what I do is I look at the system that's in place, right? And probably a good portion of the landscape mechanics or the systems that are kind of standardized from the old guard in terms of sequencing, project management, bidding, those kind of infrastructure. There's probably a lot of that doesn't need to change, right? In fact, it's something that you could adopt. So you're not reinventing the wheel where you don't need to. Like you don't necessarily need to reinvent bookkeeping unless you're passionate about reinventing bookkeeping. Like I wasn't passionate about that. And that's one of the early mistakes I made, was trying to reinvent everything. And luckily I had people like Ray Kane pointing out the fact that I wasn't a very good bookkeeper and I should focus on landscape, right? And so looking at what is working and looking at what's not, and then finding that place where what's not working that you have a solution for or are passionate to find a solution for, hopefully has some economic intersection for you as well, like a client who needs it solved or no one's addressing it, and it might be a niche that you can then open yourself up to and use to promote yourself. And then if you're selling a quality product and you're professional first, like I feel like those have to come first if you're going to enter the market, even, and that's maybe not what brought us to this career, right? But if you don't have a professional a persona or professional image, and you're not bringing a quality product, you're not going to get the platform to change the system. So stepping in that way, first and foremost, whatever that means for your market and your region, combined with your own value system, and then looking at how you can clean things up, and then advertising how you're doing it different, how you're cleaning things up. You don't have to worry about your kids crawling around in our landscapes. That's pretty powerful, right? And so I hope that's helpful in terms of, you find that spot that you can get the wedge in.
So that's like an angle of because we're non-toxic and we're not using any chemicals.
Yeah,
you can let your kids roam around. No, this is a healthy place for your children. Like that'd be like a good angle in terms of marketing these in a cultural environment that maybe doesn't appreciate ecological design.
Yeah, exactly. Mm-hmm. I've often said, my clients don't have to care about the ecology. They're going to get an eco-literate landscape anyway, because I'm not going to do the other kind. Right? I'm not going to contaminate our waterways for someone's aesthetic, right? And at least not directly. So you can look at, the impact of what you're building, but also how it's maintained, right? Which often we have less control over.
Well, what you say brings up a funny story, and I may have already told the story in one of the student portal sessions. So if you've already heard this, sorry about the quick review. But so I was just maybe 3 years into Permaculture Artisans, my landscape contracting company, and I had made this connection with a guy who was a general contractor who worked for all these vineyards around, and they were doing developments like barns and wine processing centers and things like that. And he was interested in potentially having an ecological landscaper to help him create, integrate all his work in an ecological way on these vineyards, and maybe help the wineries with surface water management and soil building and habitat and all these things. So I got invited to a meeting at a fancy restaurant in the town near where we live, Santa Rosa. So I go to this fancy restaurant, but to this meeting, I'm wearing at that time, long hair. I had my hair in braids, 2 braids. And I had this big green wool jacket that was like kind of hairy, furry wool jacket. It was my favorite jacket, man. That was like, I traveled the world in that jacket. And when I walked into this restaurant for this lunch meeting, this man with all his associates, they were all wearing suits and ties. And as soon as I walked in, one of his associates said, "Cool jacket. Can you smoke it?" And it was, and they all laughed. And it was in that moment that I realized that, I wasn't going to be working with these folks. That just because of my image at that time, that was it. They were going to, and unfortunately, that was an opportunity to get into a big toxic industry and potentially start to clean it up from the inside out. But I totally lost the opportunity because I didn't really show up professionally. Now, that's not to say you should totally change your image, cut your hair, never wear big wool, puffy wool jackets, because I still love those. But know the culture you're stepping into when you step into a meeting. Like if that was to happen to me today, I would be button up shirt. I would be, trimmed beard. I would, and I would really present myself professionally as a way to get my foot in the door.
Yeah, I think the way I would say it is know the norms that you're breaking when you're breaking them, right? Whether those are social norms or whether they're business norms or, logistical norms within the landscape industry. Just know it well, right? Master your career, or it will master you. And it's just good to know when you're breaking a norm, because then you can use it strategically, right? Rather than being caught off guard by it.
So let's take this next question from Coy. And so he says, you mentioned using materials that are commercially available for sheet mulching. Can you speak on your process and what those materials are that you work with? And I think when you did bring up the whole conversation about sheet mulching and irrigation in the landscape, I know my light bulb was like, oh yeah, what is Rick's process for that? And I imagine some of you all were thinking the same thing, like, oh boy, he must have a very specific step-by-step process. So maybe you can share some of that too.
Yeah, I'm currently revisiting it, and I'm having to prove myself. I'm choosing to prove myself because I want the relationship to be built, and I want to respect this subcontractor's process. I now do a lot of subcontracting and don't run my own installation crews in-house. And so, our standard, we needed to, mulch is one of the things that goes down fast and easy. And so if you're looking at line item to line item comparisons, my numbers were way higher, right? And so I had to justify that, because people aren't excited about mulch. Most of my clients, they're excited about plants. They'll pay disproportionately for plants more than they need to, because they want them. And the industry, some of the industry knows that, and they charge more there and they charge less in other areas. But the sheet mulch was very critical in being able to then have the non-toxic or low toxicity maintenance plan controlling weeds, right? And so we looked at what was out there, and we finally settled on using commercial grade compost. And again, this isn't massive amounts of soil improvement all at once, and it varies if you have high feeding plants. But in a mixed perennial landscape bed that doesn't have a lot of heavy feeders, this works just fine. And so we would lay 1 to 2 inches of compost right on the surface. Unless it was hard pan, then we might break it up a little bit. And then we searched out and bought a rolled paper. And most of the industry around here, and I believe it was Sentient Landscapes who really led that early on, uses a corrugated roll. So it's a big roll, really lightweight, one side's corrugated. And I chose to go a different route personally, and I used wax or craft paper, and I think it was a 40-pound. And so it's kind of like butcher paper if you buy meats at the store from a butcher, without the waxing on one side, so a thick brown paper. And so I'd lay that across the mulch, and it went down really, really fast. And then on top of that, 3 inches of our local wood chip mulch. And that was our sheet mulch. And it added a nutrient layer, it added a weed blocking layer, and then it added the wood chip layer, which ultimately becomes a compost unto itself as it breaks down. And then we would plant through that, and we would put our drip on top of the paper, but beneath the mulch. And then we would dust everything with the corn gluten soybean oil mixture as a weed suppressant. And there's obviously a carbon footprint to all of that. There's a lot to argue about corn-based weed suppressants as well. But again, I was choosing compromise in order to move things forward. I still do. So that's my sheet mulch standard.
Yeah, I remember years ago, because I think the way we used to do cardboard and then compost and then wood chips. And you taught me to separate the compost and wood chips with your sheeting, with your cardboard or your paper or whatever it is. And what that does is it keeps the compost and wood chips from mixing, which is really cool. It leaves her much cleaner. And then if weed seeds are blowing in, they don't have that nice rich compost to seed right into that first year.
Yeah, and if you have any weeds in your area that are making it through the heat of the composting operation, excuse me, ours was purslane. Purslane was a common one that made its way through, which, wasn't that bad of a management problem. But by putting the paper over the top of the compost, you're doing an additional level of suppression to any weed that didn't get sterilized or completely composted in the composting operation.
And did you ever find that, were there ever issues with having the irrigation on top of the cardboard layer?
Yeah, there is, and that's what we're currently going through now. I don't have the freedom on this particular project. It's heavily designed.
Your current project.
My current project.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have the depth. I can't just throw 4 inches. I only have 2 inches of wood chip. And so if I have, my subgrade or my grade, my bare soil, then I have compost, then I have paper, and then I only have 2 inches to hide that drip line. The drip line's a 1/2 inch, so I only have 1.5 inches of mulch on top, which means I'm not going to finish planting before those drip lines start showing. And they can't show, it ruins the aesthetic of a landscape. So, and I've also installed designs that landscape architects have designed that we didn't, and they mandated that the lines be buried. And so then if you're not using a grid system and you're using an emitter at each plant, you have to sheet mulch after, and then it becomes a nightmare with all these small little strips all over the place. And but currently what we're doing is we've decided that the amount of drip line is not enough to stop this. We will actually cut the paper, and we will trench, if necessary, the drip line down if we can't weasel it down into the compost, and then we'll just patch over that little strip. And that's how we're currently solving it, to get those drip lines deeper into the landscape so they don't show.
Great. So next question from Jessica: how do you professionalize the call and response conversation with the landscape? How do you make room for that shifting of info once the landscape responds without coming off as flip-floppy? So do you understand that?
Like, I think so.
That dialogue you have with the landscape, and as you're out there, maybe you go on your project tomorrow and you observe some wildlife path, or you observe, some kind of rare plant that just cropped up in the spring, right in a certain zone. And do you shift your design around that? And how do you work that in a professional process?
Yeah. So I think, I'm not sure how many years you have under your belt, but I find that as I get more, I'm surprised less and less. There's certain things that I can see them earlier. So that's part of it. But still, even now, there's things that develop on a very regular basis where we're adapting to changing. Or maybe we've just decided that, wow, that was kind of a bad idea. That doesn't look nearly as good as we thought it would. And if the budget allows, we might change that. So I think setting an early tone that some things change once a design moves to installation, right? And I think most people inherently understand that. It's more fluid than the construction of a home, for sure, but it doesn't have to be completely unstructured. which I don't think you're suggesting. So in the design phase, doing the due diligence to really look and study and question your ideas, and hopefully you have partners, friends, colleagues that you can run things by. The learning curve shortens when you can have other people look at your work, and head off as many of those early on, right? Where the design is meant to be exploratory, right? At least at certain phases, and laying that out ahead of time. Like I say we have to entertain the ridiculous, or we will never move beyond our comfort zones. And so I set that tone early on in the design process that we're going to explore things that may seem ridiculous right now to see where our boundaries really are. And then setting that tone.
You say that to your client?
I do. I'm like, let's entertain the ridiculous. And
Yes.
Some of the entrepreneurial clients, they get it. And some of the more engineered mind clients, if you will, may not, or at first. So some people embrace it, some people resist it, most people ultimately accept it and see its value. And so doing my due diligence during the design process to minimize the changes, but also setting the tone that as this thing goes to layout, where we actually lay the landscape out, and I suggest the whole thing gets laid out with stakes that show the elevations of each element, so that you're field testing and field verifying. 20 years in, like, we do triple checks on our grades and really lay it all out, just because things do change and mistakes are made. So setting that tone that we should expect some minor changes, and that not only, like, not in a negative way even, but like, I'm skilled enough and I understand this process enough to know that it's going to change a little, and I'm here for you, right? Like, I can, not only can I deal with those changes, they're part of the normal process. And then when they do come up, that the clients, that you have a process to deal with them. So the path has an additional step, let's say, and that additional step has a cost implication of $300. And so that you're moving to the client, you can articulate why it's happening, why it's necessary. If it was some fault of you or your design team, taking some accountability, but also having the financial repercussions ready when you present to the client. Like, we're going to have an extra step here. Here's why. It's going to cost $350. Here's why it's mandatory, or here are some other options instead. So that's how I would maintain professionalism and credibility through the process where things change, because things definitely change when they hit the ground.
Well, and I think I like too, you're kind of applying that permaculture principle of the problem is the solution, where it's almost as if when these moments happen where you're expecting change to happen, you have a process to back you up when those changes occur, when you make that observation in the land that shifts things, that those are almost like, those can be bonding moments with clients.
Yeah, for sure.
Right? I mean, those can be moments of truth.
Yeah. How do you handle yourself when a surprise comes up? How do you handle yourself if it was your mistake? Is it something that that you take on and you just do for free? Is it something that you do at cost? Is it part of the agreement where, it's a reasonable expectation of change that you couldn't have foresaw with the design process that you all agreed to? And so there's a lot of complexity there. But when we hit uncertainty with someone, stepping into our highest self, not necessarily being selfless, because we are in a financial agreement as well, and we're doing this to make a living, but stepping into your higher self and being willing to have that conversation and talk it through. And, sometimes when I talk it through with clients and I don't have a predisposed position, sometimes by the end I'm like, this was kind of on me, and I think I should just make this right. And other times it's not on me, and it's a normal part of the process, and we move forward. So it's important to be accountable in our design process, but also not set or buy into this expectation that the design is entirely static. It's not a widget. It's not a factory floor. The process should be systematized as much as possible, just for ease and quality and profitability. But it's there's some variables that just aren't easy to control.
Yeah, and I found that some of the best, some of my lifelong clients, some of the best ones are the clients that we had to work through some big issue, some challenge came up, whether it was unforeseen or it was something that we did or something another contractor did, and it was sort of drama and figuring things out. But then once we went through that, it's like it's like building relationship. Then all of a sudden they're like, well, you're the only person I would ever want to work with, because I know that when like really challenging things happen, I know I can trust you. I know that you're in integrity. I can communicate with you. You're going to be honest with me. And all of a sudden now you have built the kind of trust and loyalty that can last for multiple phases of projects.
Yeah. I mean, think about how many times in your own life you've stayed with the status quo, even though it wasn't right for you, because it was a known entity, right? And so there's a really powerful thing humans have with staying with what is familiar, even if it's not good for them. And so imagine building a relationship where tension arises and you're actually good for them, that you hold your integrity through that process, right? First of all, it was organized to begin with, right? But when it did break out of the system that you had covered, because it will, you know, you're going to make mistakes. I still make mistakes. My colleagues who have 30, 40 employees say someone right now is screwing something up on one of my projects. Guaranteed, right?
At any moment.
At any moment, at every moment, somebody is, right? And so, but when you build that bond, it can be pretty fantastic. Early on, my model was design, build, maintain. I wanted to maintain everything we built. And I acquired my mentor's company at the time, his maintenance division, when he needed to let it go. And that helped me, you know, have a machine that was running that I could then add my installations to, right? Because I needed enough to actually support a full-time employee. And maintenance is high maintenance when it comes to it's a much different relationship than the installation relationship. And inevitably, most of the times that we would make a mistake in maintenance and my clients would be upset, my goal was to go smooth it over and, you know, maybe give them a month free or whatever. But most times we walked away with a renovation contract. They wanted us to do more, right? Because we heard them, we showed up, we made it right, and then the conversation turned to, you know, nicer, easier things. And I think the single most important thing outside of, you know, the clarity of contracts and all of that is making sure your clients feel heard. It's really takes a lot of tension off and buys you a lot of social capital.
That is, man, that's gold right there. Making sure your clients feel heard. So what kind of tech strategies do you have, or, you know, techniques that do you reflect them? Or, I mean, what do you do if I'm, you know, if we're having a process and I'm just like, I can't believe that you guys put that on the map in the wrong place. You know, it's 1 foot from where it's supposed to be. It's affected the whole process and it's going to cost me thousands of dollars. I can't believe you messed up, Rick. Why?
Yeah, well, I'm really sorry that this has happened, and I've just now stepped onto the site and realized this is happening, and I can see it's really frustrating for you, and you really invested a lot of time.
Damn right, it's frustrating.
You've invested a lot of time and money in our firm, and we've asked for your trust, and it appears that maybe we've made a mistake, and I really don't have an answer for you right now, because I'm still trying to figure this out. But I will come back to you with an answer immediately, hopefully within the next half hour, but by the end of the day, to explain how this happened. And most likely I will also have the solution for you as well in that, you know, this afternoon. So again, I'm really sorry that this has happened, and I can't really provide you any answers right now, but I'm going to go find those answers. Is there anything else that, you know, we can talk about right now before I go solve this?
Well, I did want to add that extra little garden area.
Sure, I would love to do that.
It doesn't always happen that easily, but I appreciate that you stay calm. Yeah,
and there's times that it's hard to stay calm, and sometimes it's not $1,000. our firm, some of our decisions that we make are easily $100,000-$200,000 decisions. When we're setting the corner of a pool, right, that costs $150,000, the setting of that corner, if it relates to other fixed, surfaces, can be a really stressful decision. So taking the time that you need to really know your stuff. And when I'm the most confident in tense situations, it's when I've made sure that I know what I'm doing, and I'm really clear as to where I don't know, right? Like, or I'm really confident in all of this. This section makes me a little nervous. I feel like I have a learning curve here, right? And you should always have learning curves, or we're going to get stale. We're not going to, we're not going to grow. We're not going to stay excited. But we got to stay within our integrity. And so, the areas in which I'm reaching outside of my skill set a little bit and stretching, I do extra due diligence. I have staff review. We do, what I call back checks. We'll set, that corner strategically with triangulation. Maybe you've studied this yet or not, I don't know. But then we'll also come at it from a different angle, or maybe we'll have a surveyor hit it as well, or we'll back up the survey with some analog tools. And, so there's always, I do a lot of double checking to the point where it really, starts to trouble my staff. But that gives me the confidence that we're making the right decision, and that, Eric just didn't realize that 2 conversations ago, when he was distracted, his partner and I moved the fountain over 12 inches, right? And I had forgotten that in the moment because he was coming at me all angry, and I was a little thrown off. But, so I chose not to react, and I have to work at not reacting, because sometimes the interactions are quite intense.
Yes. Okay, so we have another question here from Claudia. A budgeting question. Do you have resources for estimating establishment and maintenance costs for NRCS conservation practice standards, such as tree shrub establishment or hedgerows? Ideally, a table that shows cost per acre linear foot for each NRCS practice.
Wow. The short answer is no, I do not. Sebastian might have something like that. I'm not really sure. But those are the types of systems that you indeed do build within your company. And you build that by tracking your work, right? So when you guys are making estimates, you then track how long it actually took you to do each specific task in a very detailed and potentially monotonous way. And that allows you to build charts like that. Now, you may be asking about a chart that exists somewhere. I don't do a lot of that work. Some of my partners do. But those are the kind of systems that some of my courses will help teach you to build in your own company.
Yeah, and Claudia, feel free to email Sebastian on that. He may actually have something like that, because we've worked on a few NRCS projects. And I like what Rick says about, every project that you do is an opportunity to develop those numbers, to track what it takes, and to develop that. It becomes a foundational part of your business when you can just easily go back and be like, okay, here's a hedgerow that we did for an NRCS contract, and this is how long it was. Here's how many plants we put in. Here's the size of the plants. Here's how much mulch. Here's how much compost. Here's how much time it took, how much it cost. And then you can kind of extrapolate from there as you get more projects similar to that.
Yeah.
Jesse is asking, Jesse says, I'm about to move to a new region. Would you recommend building a maintenance business to break into a new market for design install? What comes up when you're maintaining other people's designs? So it's kind of 2 questions there.
Yeah. So the beauty about starting at the maintenance level is that it's incredibly, there's an incredibly low barrier of entry in terms of the amount of equipment that you need. It's usually something you can start to put together all at once, or easily just kind of add it. The pickup truck is obviously something that becomes critical at a certain point, and ideally you'd start with that. So, and then you can move up the ranks really quickly. You can accept almost anything. Like at the low end of maintenance, where you might start, you'll have a ton of competition in terms of folks who just kind of mow and blow and move on. And then you can easily set yourself apart from that by learning the ins and outs of irrigation, because at those lower entry levels, that's a skill that's not that common. And then soil enhancement, fertilizer, plant care, like the more you have of that you can quickly separate yourself and move up. Maybe you don't even start in competing with that particular group of maintenance people. You can start higher. But I do think it's a great way. If it's a one-person show, it's incredibly time consuming, right? To be a one-person show, because you're doing all of the technical work and then all of the business work as well. But it is how I started. I literally started with a pickup truck and a wheelbarrow, and a lot of bills to pay, and pushed really hard. And then maintenance easily transitions into renovations, right? Can I replace that rose? So how about a little landscape addition over here, or maybe a water feature? And then you can start getting your chops in terms of installation skills if you want to go that direction. And then it can build out from there. And I forgot the second part of it.
And I know Jesse's got the skills, and so I think Jesse, I think one thing I'm hearing Rick saying is the way that you market yourself as maintenance, that you want to be in that niche of how do you irrigation master, organic management. You're not the mow, blow and go. Like, how do you market yourself and position yourself totally separate from those, the kind of 95% of maintenance crews are the lawnmowers and blowers, and then that, so it's a kind of a positioning and a marketing thing.
Yeah, it really is a positioning thing, and you can't compete with mow, blow and go pricing. That's just not where you want to be. And when we had a maintenance division, we definitely mowed lawns, because almost everyone had a lawn, especially the ones that we acquired. Many of the ones that we built ourselves didn't, or they were minimal, but it was just part of the deal. So we did, but we didn't, if someone called us, just to mow lawns, we knew they weren't going to hire us. We would have a good conversation with them, but ultimately by the end, it was clear we weren't good for each other in that way. But I do find it's a great model to get going. As it increases, what you'll realize is that maintenance is low margins, meaning that people don't really want to pay a lot for maintenance because it's an ongoing cost, where they'll pay a lot more, even maybe more than necessary, in an installation, because it's a one-time cost. And so when you look around, look at the business models around and how are they structured around maintenance. So the big commercial firms who are mostly mowing, fertilizing, and trimming hedges in commercial parks, they work on a volume model. Like, they're doing a lot of work, and the maintenance itself is really inexpensive, and they charge a lot for repairs. Like, that's part of their profit model. And then you have mid-sized landscape firms that are doing more custom residential. That's a harder niche you can charge more money, but it's just a harder niche to make work once the company gets larger and larger, right? What's beautiful about it is you have a cash flow that's coming in every month, right? And when you have money moving, you can do a lot of things with it, versus not having money or stagnant money. But often in the end, it doesn't make as much as installation, but it doesn't mean it can't make a very decent living and grow into a substantial size company, but it's got different challenges.
And Jesse's second part of the question is, what comes up when you're maintaining other people's designs?
Well, I don't find that you come across that too much in terms of from the angle of having to maintain it a certain way so that someone's happy, like the designer's happy. The designer is usually only involved on really high-end projects when it comes to maintenance. So it's usually about a direct interaction with the homeowner. And when you're in someone's space on a regular basis, like, you have to pay attention and take into account idiosyncrasies, like, don't park here. Like, parking in the wrong spot after multiple conversations can wear on your relationship with the client. So it's like, the more you're around, the more you have to really manage the relationship. But some of the practical pieces of installing a design that you didn't build or design,
maintaining one.
I'm sorry, maintaining one, is that you don't know where the pipes are. You don't know where the valves are. Those you'll find easy, but the underground pipes, you don't really know. If you break a pipe, you kind of don't know the path it was taking. Excuse me. So you don't necessarily know, all the nuts and bolts and how to best fix it. And so there's a lot of those things that are just, assumed additional costs or frustrations. You might not know that plant is struggling because it only has 4 inches of soil and there's an old concrete slab someone didn't remove. So those kind of surprises are just going to come along, but those are more brass tacks. And you're probably not going to have too much input from the designer in terms of, are you doing it right? Usually they're long gone by that point.
Well, and I would say another thing that comes up is if someone's hiring you to manage their landscape now, and maybe they had someone design and install it, or maybe they just have some simple, old landscape and they just need help keeping it clean or whatever. If they're hiring you, they're going to want your input. They don't just want you to they want you to come up with the solutions, right? So often what I find is when a client is changing, when they're hiring someone new, especially from a maintenance point of view, they don't really love what was happening before often. And in your client assessment phase, when you're really assessing and learning those idiosyncrasies and stuff, you'll kind of learn like, well, what are the things that they really don't like, what are the stuff that they're looking for. It might just be like, gosh, I just feel like my plants are always stressed out. They're just not thriving. And then that will lead you down the road to, soil health, hard pan, or the irrigation system isn't working, or, all the things that all your site assessment analysis pieces come in. And then you get to be the hero by showing up with a solution, and probably coming from an ecological or design point of view, you're probably coming up with innovative solutions they have never heard of, because currently culturally we don't, ecological design is just a small part of what people see as landscaping culturally. So you get to be that hero and introduce new things, and then you can build that relationship from there. And then the other thing I wanted to say too, specific to you, Jesse, moving into a new area and all of that, there's really sort of like two different kinds of maintenance programs or maintenance companies. There's the one Rick has had and talked a lot about, which is more about maintaining a health and aesthetic within a landscape. So it's deadheading flowers, it's making sure the hardscapes are cleaned out, it's repairing irrigation and cleaning the filters, it's pruning the fruit trees, just kind of like all that basic maintenance stuff. Then there's this other kind of maintenance, I would say more stewardship management strategy, which is more what Permaculture Artisans has been doing, only with maybe 3 clients, right? 'Cause the benefit of a stewardship service is that those projects are usually bigger, multi-acre or even broad acre, even hundreds of acres. And if you could even just get one project like that, where you're looking at fire fuel load management, you're looking at pastoral management, trying to work a new vegetative species cover in a pasture by bringing in timed mowing at the right time, or by bringing in a great planned grazing, that to be able to get on a project like that, where it's not really design and installation so much as it is just management of the land, just stewardship of the land. So kind of knowing those two different kinds is good, in that what I find is the second one, the stewardship one, is hardly anybody's offering services to that.
For sure.
And most often big ranches are going to have their own workforce, so you'd probably be too expensive. But I have found, because we have some of these clients, and sometimes we get some where we create a management plan for them and work with them for about a year, and then they realize that they can't afford to keep us on, and they get a caretaker, a live-in caretaker or something like that. But I find that helping people get, in terms of managing their land, not just their landscape, but their natural resources, that being able to provide folks support and planning around that is really a niche that I know a lot of regenerative ag folks are starting to step into that. But especially in fire prone areas, when we look at fuel load and we look at management for fire, obviously here in Sonoma County and all throughout California right now, it's a huge deal, but all over the world, So that could be another angle to look at it.
And as we talk more, I mean, you'll find that systems are really important, like to look at the whole system that you're stepping into and develop internal systems in your business, right? That you step to a new client, if it's like a broadacre, you have a list of things that you already know to be looking for, to be asking for, problem areas. And this all comes with experience, but be tracking those. Like in residential, if you're bumping into problems, you know, you're probably going to bump into those problems again, you know, at the next job. So you'll eventually create a kind of an upgrade list that is mandatory for you to maintain the landscape. Like if we don't do this up front, it's just going to cost a lot more money, and we're going to provide you with poor results, right? If you don't aerate the lawn, if you don't fertilize the plants, if you don't mulch the landscape, if you don't, you know, reduce the fire load, etc. So stepping in with as much of an understanding and a coherent system that you can articulate to the clients to set yourself apart is important.
So Rick, so folks, we've got about 15 minutes left. If you have more questions, get them in now so we have time to answer them. And so we've covered a lot of different topics and stuff. And I think that one thing that you bring that is, I think, different from a lot of folks that we've had on as experts and a lot of our students is that you've really experienced all the different facets of running of what's possible with ecological landscaping. And what I mean by that is, say, for instance, permaculture artisans, we are a design build management firm. We haven't really built out that maintenance program like the way you had, and our management projects are, you know, we only have a couple, so we're mainly design and installation. And you've had a full-on landscape maintenance program, you've had installation crews, you do design, and but now you have a model that is unique in a way. And I think it's really beneficial for our students to realize that there's like so many different business models within ecological landscaping. There's no like one size fits all type of thing. And so maybe you could tell us a little bit about your current model. Sure. And maybe speak a little bit to what are some of the benefits, what are some of the benefits and or challenges with, you know, different aspects of providing these services? Yeah. So and Adam, we'll get to your question here in just a moment.
So my intent was to build a design, build, maintain firm. So I had control over everything, or at least influence. And, you know, like the landscape, you know, we go through this process of design and then we build it, but we don't really see its full potential for years to come, right? Like a 3-year and a 5-year mark are pretty, 1, 3, and 5 are pretty substantial milestones, but still. So I wanted to be able to have that. And so I went the standard route where I had design in-house and my own installation crew and then my own maintenance crew. And within the design, build, maintain model, there's varying levels of quality of each one, right? And a lot of design, build, maintains are really light on design. They're very light from a landscape architecture perspective. Sometimes they're even like a loss leader, meaning they undersell or underprice the design just to get the job because install is where the money's made. Now, that doesn't mean the design has to be poor. It just means it's not a financial income center. And so I wanted to be design heavy. So I actually had landscape designers and landscape architectural trained folks in my design staff, right? And so that was a profit center, and we produced a higher level of design. We would then build it, and then we would maintain it. And like I said, the largest margin was install. The largest amount of money was install. The largest margin, the difference between what I paid versus what I received, was in design. And then maintenance had the lowest margins of them, but they provided cash flow, and I wanted to provide this all-inclusive package to people. So that was my model for 12 or 15 years. I then went on sabbatical, or was about to, and we'd spent a year or so designing a pretty large estate. And I told her that I was selling my company and moving on, the installation portion. And she was adamant that I do not leave. And so I, of course, had dissolved my company, but I moved into kind of a consulting role, managing other landscape subcontractors. I brought them in to build it, and that set the tone for my new model. So I took sabbatical and then I came back, and what I have now is I've hired licensed landscape architects to work in my design division. So we have a pretty advanced ability for our design, and our packages are pretty substantial in their detail. We also have the licensure that we can legally just do design, because California has some more complicated rules about who can design and who can't. And then I no longer have an involvement with maintenance in terms of ongoing, but we will write a maintenance plan, and we will help the client find a maintenance contractor that meets their budget and is helpful. Excuse me, not helpful, but is competent and can do the work. And then the whole build portion now is more of a general contracting model. So we have our C27 license, which in California is required to do this work, but our license is very broad. So I subcontract out the landscape team. If it's in a large estate, there's probably an electrician that does the low voltage lighting rather than the landscaper. Excuse me, the arborist, the mason, the swimming pool contractor, if there is one. So what I really offer is all those systems I keep talking about that I've built over the years by tracking, by managing, by getting to know the brass tacks of building. I've built a management system, and that's what I'm selling to people now on the installation side. So I took the parts that I love, that I'm the best at, even if I don't love them, and the highest margins. And I put that together into a package to design and build landscapes. And so my goal is that our design division can design through multiple income levels. So we're not just working at the highest income level, and that we have the ability to do commercial and ecological restoration, and we can move into that because we have licensure that allows that. The project management model that I'm doing does start to price you out of even out of middle class clientele. You have to start moving into higher incomes and much larger projects, or maybe commercial projects, or if you have government projects. I don't really land in that world very easily. Business more so than government. And so it was a little scary because I was going to move into a different clientele entirely, but it was also the model that I really feel will be successful for me, and it has been recently. So, and there's variations to that as well. So if you look at general contracting folks who build houses, a lot of them do their own framing, right? So they have carpentry crews. So part of the build they're still doing, but then they sub out other components. And a friend of ours, Joff, had a similar model where they would sub out a lot of the landscape, but they had a smaller crew that did certain parts of it themselves, right? So it doesn't have to be all or nothing. And in fact, subcontracting out other skilled people and subcontracting properly based on your local laws and is a great way to be able to take on projects that you currently can't do because you don't have the staff or you don't have the skill, right? You need to have enough understanding of the skill that you're hiring so that you can manage properly. But you don't have to be a mason, but you have to know enough about masonry to know whether they know what they're doing and how to catch mistakes. So that's my current model. And I don't think I could have done this model effectively without having gone through all of the nuts and bolts of a design, build, maintain firm.
So when you say you're hiring a mason, you're hiring a landscape installation crews, you're hiring a local electrician, you're hiring an arborist, when the client gets the invoice, they're just getting an invoice from you, not from all these other characters, right? You're the middleman, so to speak, that all these other subcontractors are working through. They're giving you invoices, you're invoicing them, the subcontractors, you're paying them, and then you're invoicing the client in order to recoup that.
Really good question. Yeah, so there's a couple of models. Obviously, if I'm hiring all these people out and I'm managing them, I have to make money somehow. So I'm either charging management fees, I'm charging a % markup, on top. They charge me $100, I charge $125 to the client, kind of thing, or a combination or both. There is a model that I use sometimes where if some clients are averse to that markup. They think it leaves a bad taste in their mouth. I can mark up less, and they can have direct contracts with each one of the contractors. That can cause some problems and kind of like chain of authority, when things go a little sideways, because sometimes they do. But it also increases their risk and reduces mine. And so in that case, they get all of them, but I manage them all. And in the case of me just subcontracting everybody, they just get an invoice from me, which is the cleanest. And to be able to sell yourself as a project management firm or that division, that requires a different skill set than building landscapes. It requires your ability to be financially literate, to have the right language when discussing contracts, to have real contracts that are strong and fair, and be able to speak to all of the liability issues that come along and the risks people take who have higher levels of income, and what their losses truly are, what are their true risks, and understanding that and being able to use language and be sensitive to their perspective of loss and liability, and be able to address those concerns through insurance, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a much different skill set, but it's a very much a complementary skill set to landscaping or any business.
Absolutely. So good. So we're going to take the last question here from Adam. And Adam is asking, he's saying, regenerative agriculture is what I'm most interested in. Do either of you have suggestions of what type of clients and niches are worth pursuing in that type of a business model?
Yeah, I feel like that's like, such a beautiful path to go down, and a little frightening in terms of the business model and finding those folks. But I think what it is, at least in this region, do you know where this person is?
No, Adam, we're not sure where you are. Maybe you can just let us know what region you're working in. That might help us.
So there's, there's government agencies who now have people who understand permaculture and or eco-literacy in some sense. And so there can be larger projects on larger open space public lands that you can tap into. And you have to have the stomach for bureaucracy and the ability to move through that, and a lot of paperwork usually to be able to play in the government realm. But I think that's one possible area. And I know Colorado.
Mm-hmm.
I think you have a lot less regulations in terms of landscape in Colorado and building, based on my limited conversations. So it might be a little easier. But I think the clientele is the question. And what we're finding out here is there's a lot of people moving. We have a lot of people from Silicon Valley, Los Angeles, even San Francisco as well, that are moving up to the country and either living here or having second homes, that once they step outside of the immediate landscape of their house, they know nothing. They have no idea how to manage it. They don't know what to do. They really have a desire to care for it. And a lot of times even like this childlike love of nature, which is really quite beautiful to see. And so that is definitely a market that I see people around here working in, is people who are able to afford land, don't know how to take care of it, and have the resources and the desire to maintain it properly. And I think that's, at least for now, a really good niche to start into.
Yeah, I would agree. I would say regenerative agriculture is obviously picking up a lot of steam globally in terms of producers. And like we've mentioned, we're going to have Darren Doherty on for a 3-part series over the next few months, so we can talk deeper with him about how this broadacre regenerative design approach. But in practicality, if you're not attaching yourself to a big producer project, someone who's, we're going to grow, we're going to do however many head of cattle on 1,000 acres, or we're going to put in a big agroforestry project and plant 20,000 trees that we're going to harvest at some point. I think those projects are far and few between, but like what Rick is mentioning is really management. We say regenerative agriculture, but the other flip side of that is that when we look at the benefit, how we regenerate landscapes, just that in of itself, take the agriculture part out for a moment, that we often need animals and agricultural methodologies to regenerate land on a broad acre scale. So I've had projects, multi-100-acre projects, where the client didn't want to necessarily grow cattle to sell cattle for beef, but he wanted to manage 200 acres of grassland. And that was filled with a lot of exotics and invasives, and he wanted to bring natives back. And so that was what the whole project was how do we regenerate this 200 acres of grassland? And of course, in our region, what was appropriate was bringing cattle on and using a planned grazing methodology and looking at keyline planning and water spreading and all that kind of stuff. So we were able to bring regenerative agriculture systems into a management regime towards an end goal of moving towards a native bunchgrass prairie. So I think that we're going to find a lot more folks like that with the big landowners who want to manage and steward their lands responsibly, ecologically. And those are more, I think those are the low-hanging fruit for clients like what you're asking about, Adam. And then the other one I would say is that a lot of the big ag endeavors, like around here, we have a lot of dairy farms, and we have some beef cattle, and then a lot of vineyards. And one of the things we can do as ecological designers is help supplement the systems that they have to manage some of the big challenges that they're constantly dealing with, like surface water runoff. You got these huge dairy farms, and they've got these big manure piles, and they're really the watershed's getting polluted because during the winter rains, it's washing all the stuff down into the creeks. They're getting dinged by the county for that. And so we can come up with solutions on a broad acre scale for utilizing that material in the landscape, or for catching and managing that surface water. So another thing that we do is we work with the government. So that was a good point that Rick made too about working with government agencies. We work with the Resource Conservation District to develop rain catchment systems on some of these large dairy farms. They've got these massively huge barns with just, thousands and thousands of square feet of impervious roof surfaces. And we can put 100,000-gallon rain catchment tank there and reduce the need for them to use their wells in the summer. So there's a lot of different angles there. There's management, there's ecological retrofitting of agricultural systems, which I think is a big one to provide the solutions.
Absolutely.
And then I would say the harder one, actually, which is the one that everyone talks about in regenerative ag space, is to design a production system. And I think that's harder because the capital it takes to put into that in order to get something out of it, to bridge that gap, and we could talk with Darren Doherty about this, is, that's a big challenge for most people. So
and a farm needs a farmer, and it's hard to not have that person be designing and running the system as it evolves.
Yeah. Okay. So very last question. We're keeping you a little bit late here, Rick. Right. Okay. Final question, folks. And I promise you we'll bring Rick back. Mateo sent me a message earlier this week saying that making the suggestion that we bring experts back after we've introduced them to you all, so that you now have building a relationship with them, and that what they bring to the table, and you can ask better questions. So I talked to Rick about that. We'll definitely be bringing him back. You'll see more from him. So final question is from Koi. Food forest, different from typical landscape design installation estimates. In my experience, what is your preferred method, i.e. how you come up with your numbers for food forest estimates?
Well, to me, a food forest is a multi-storied perennial landscape, right? So, in the world of holistic thinking, let's not completely eliminate reductionist thinking and breaking pieces apart, right? Because when we break them apart, we can start to see where similarities exist, and where, how similar that is to a traditional landscape from a cost perspective or an estimating perspective, right? It's a 1-gallon plant is a 1-gallon plant for the most part in terms of pricing. So it depends on your system of building the food forest. But assuming there's a soil enhancement component, let's call it sheet mulch, you have that, and after installing a few, you should be able to come up with a per square foot cost, right? In Northern California, it's somewhere between $1.75 and $2.50 is what I'm finding currently in the local market. And then we have a price per 1 gallon installed, or we did, and most people we work with, subcontractors do, and the same for each plant size, right? And then you have your drip irrigation component, so you break that one out, and some people do that per plant, some people have a square foot a price that they use, but breaking them into units. And that way, as long as you're planting a plant or installing sheet mulch or installing a tree, I think that from an estimating and financial perspective, that it isn't all that different from a traditional landscape, and you can juxtapose those systems over it. But what's great is the end product of a food forest is much more eco-literate and is providing so many more services than a standard landscape. But I think that's where we don't have to reinvent the pricing. And if there's something I've missed in your question, I look forward to getting a follow-up.
Well, and I want to point you to the expert session we did with Sean Berry of Lift Economy, where he went through the estimation workbook that we've provided for you all. And I know they talk about how to set up unit pricing. So that should be in the expert Hangout module in the student portal. And so that might also help too in just like, how do you get to those unit costs, right?
Yeah.
And then how do you have that recipe built inside your estimation process, so that way it doesn't take you 2 weeks to build an estimate. When the next food forest comes up, you just click here, click here, click here, click here, add in the square footage, and then boom, you've got your estimate.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's been an amazing session. Thank you, all of you, for your great questions, interacting with us. Rick, any last words for the class before we sign off?
I just want to say thank you, really. It's been a real honor to sit here and chat with you all. And thanks for having me, Eric. And I look forward to being able to produce some courses that dive into much more detail in terms of some of the business infrastructure of landscaping.
Awesome. All right. Well, until next time, everybody, thank you again so much. We will see you soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye.